When Adam and Eve eat the fruit, they eat it from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is to say, Adam and Eve were not moral agents prior to this eating. They didn't have a moral consciousness. It was in the first act of eating food that gave birth to a moral conscience. That's pretty amazing. That's to say that the most significant choice we make in our lives, ethically, may be what we choose to eat on a daily basis.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. It's Dotsie and me back again, and we are very excited to have our discussion today with our guest. So let me introduce him and tell you a little bit about him. So certain people emerge as beacons of light, guiding us towards compassion, justice, and spiritual wisdom. Today, it is our distinct honor to welcome such a person to our podcast, Rabbi Dr. Shmuly Yanklowitz. Rabbi Shmuly is not only a spiritual leader, but also a passionate advocate for animal rights and veganism. As the founder and president of Shemayim, Jewish Animal Advocacy, he promotes ethical treatment of all beings and advocates for a plant-based lifestyle. He also founded Uri L'Tzedek, an organization dedicated to promoting social justice and ethical leadership within the Jewish community and beyond. Rabbi Shmuly also, on top of this, created Yatam, a foster and adoption network providing loving homes for children. He has written 24 books and has had articles in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, as well as many other secular and religious media outlets. He has also been recognized as one of America's top rabbis by Newsweek on 2 occasions. And on a more personal level, Rabbi Shmuly donated his kidney to a stranger and takes in foster children with his wife, Shoshana. So you definitely want to stay with us as we discuss the connections between spirituality, ethics, and animal rights with Rabbi Shmuly as our guide. Very warm welcome to the show, Rabbi.
It is such a delight to be with you both. I'm an admirer of you both in the podcast, so thank you so much for having me with you.
Well, we're so happy that you're here. Finally, it took a lot of tries because you are busy traveling and spreading the good word. So we appreciate it. So tell us, you have a very interesting vegan origin story. Start the show off by sharing that with us.
Well, my wife and I had both been vegetarian for many years, and we decided to commit firmly to our values that on our wedding day, we went vegan together. And felt it was only a sacrifice. It was going to be horrible. We basically had a good life. Now we're going to have a bad life, but it was a true life. We're like, how will we ever have good cheese and good sour cream and good meat and all these? Well, not meat. We had been eating meat for a while, but we had, we said this is just going to be hard, but we believe it's right. Little did we know how much the industry would blossom to the point where it feels like no sacrifice at all anymore. And so that was a little bit of the journey. For her, I think it was primarily about health at first. For me, it was primarily about animal suffering at first. And we both kind of broadened our perspectives on our various commitments.
Well, I was going to say you're not just vegan, but that's a big deal to maintain a vegan lifestyle. But you and your wife, you're not. You're also a fierce advocate and social justice warrior. Was there sometimes with people that do all that you do in that realm, they have a moment, like a pivotal moment or experience in their life that sparked that immense passion for social justice and advocacy. Do you have a moment like that or a period of time in your life that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. One time that comes to mind in particular was going to the Global South for the first time. Over the course of the last 20-ish years, I've spent time in Guatemala and El Salvador and Ghana and Senegal and Thailand and India and places like that. But when I first went, and I spent an entire summer in Ghana, living on the floor in a village with bucket baths, and being exposed to the reality of how billions of people live in the world. And it shook me out of my comfort zone, which was just a very narrow worldview of how I grew up. And I started to realize how much more difficult it is to be a woman in the world, to be a person of color in the world, to be born in a developing country, to emerge with a disability, to live in a country where you don't have citizenship, to be born as an animal as opposed to a human animal, and so on and so forth, to be born as queer, to be born as anything that doesn't fit into the box of privilege. And it took a long time for me to kind of unpack that in a way that was not just guilt-ridden, but was actually productive, in a way that could be proud of our own identities, but also expand our empathy in a way where we can build bridges of understanding.
When you chose to become vegan, how do you feel that has made you a better follower of Judaism and a better rabbi?
I love that question. Thank you. So for me, at the core of Judaism, as I understand it, is love and compassion. That, yes, there are all these traditions and beliefs and practices, but they are all pointing us to try to live more sensitively, ethically, and spiritually. And I started to realize that one of the brilliance of survival of Judaism, such as tiny religion in the world of religions, where you have over 1 billion Muslims, over 1 billion Hindus, I mean, huge, over 1 billion, Christians. I mean, it's just huge religions and good religions. And then you're talking about 13 to 15 million Jews in the world. Like, how does these people, and then a third wiped out in the Holocaust, like, not to mention prior pogroms and crusades, like, how did this tiny people survive? And I think part of that wisdom is how to be committed to the roots of what has been inherited, while also enabling it to evolve and grow. And I found on the food front, we had remained, that the trend was one or the other. It was either to completely move away from Jewish ritual on food ethics, or to double down on stringencies as it relates to kosher laws. And what I found to be the higher manifestation in my Jewish learning was the vegan approach. That actually what kashrut, what the kosher laws were all about from the start, was cultivating a moral and spiritual consciousness. And that veganism was the ideal manifestation of that. And so embracing that, I felt helped me be a better Jew. And in terms of a better rabbi, I think that I view veganism as the floor, not the ceiling, right? Some people think, oh, I made it, I'm vegan, I'm done. Like, I don't have to grow anymore. No, I think that's the floor. Like, that's the beginning of what it means to then start to morally and spiritually grow on the next level. Okay, so I'm sensitive in this way. How about all these other ways that I can be more sensitive and thoughtful and intentional in my life? And so I view that as one area that has enabled me to go deeper in supporting other people, because behavioral change is so difficult and so frustrating for people who are trying to lose weight, or people who are trying to grow in their exercise, or trying to change, the way they talk to people or how they spend their free time. And it's so hard to change, even when we're so committed. And I view my vegan journey as, providing some insight into how we can make baby steps towards growth.
I find the Old Testament, the Torah, and the New Testament too, quite frankly, but I find it to be conflicting, and I'm wondering if I'm not the only one, that there might be some of our listeners who feel that way, and you can help us along. To me, it seems very crystal clear in Genesis that we are here to eat the plant world. And then we start to go through the Old Testament, and we are granted dominion over animals, and then really bloody animal sacrifices come up many, many times. How do you reconcile these ancient teachings with kind of, I guess I'll say, the modern day call for animal rights and ethical treatment that you live by?
Great. I'm so glad you asked that, because before I dive into some of those scriptures briefly, I would say that one of the unique things to Judaism, as I understand it, is its commitment to a process of reinterpretation. So whatever the text says is just the starting point of how that continues to evolve over millennia. And this happens again and again, that a literal read of the text would be kind of a misunderstanding of the broader commitment to Jewish ethics. As the Talmud, the whole project of the rabbis in the Talmud from about 2,000 years ago to 1,500 years ago is a process of reinterpretation that they put into place. But to go specifically to those texts, I would say there's 5 eras. The first era is the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is a vegan diet. After that is the flood story. After the flood story, it's made clear that humans are bloodthirsty. And so rather than taking out your bloodthirst on humans, take it out on animals. And in a very limited fashion, you can eat sacrificial meat. And then it evolves to only sacrificial meat in a certain location. And then it evolves to eating this type of sacrificial meat in other locations and to the kosher laws. And today, I would argue we're in a new era of that called the factory farming era. And the factory farming era, where over 99.9% of the meat comes from, and an era that is a game changer in terms of the levels of cruelty involved. Not only the game changer of the cruelties, but the game changer of the opportunities to live a healthy plant-based diet that are now available to people, which weren't here just 10 years ago, not to mention 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And so I think that those eras of evolution feel crucial to understanding that process. But in each of those stages, I think the goal was intentionality as it related to animal sacrifice. And the goal was to cultivate a deeper moral consciousness of our responsibility to animals themselves. And sometimes the texts aren't totally clear about that, but the commentators are constantly rehashing the opposite approach, which is the approach of just killing thoughtlessly and consistently. And I believe that all of those kosher laws were intended to move us gradually towards that vegan diet.
Why would a loving God want us to kill an innocent animal in reverence to him?
Oh, yes. Great. Yes, exactly. Yes, totally. So I think that in 2024, it's very hard to relate to those texts. But I think that had a loving God emerged, 3,300 years ago and said, hey, I want everyone to go vegan now, it wouldn't have worked. It just wouldn't have worked.
It's still not working, Rabbi. No.
It's still not working. If a loving God emerged today and said, hey, I'm now talking to the world, I'm here to say, right? So you're right. And so the way I understand it is that a gradual mechanism was put into place, starting from very many non-ideals. Like I'll give you another example. I'm personally opposed to the death penalty. The Torah suggests that the death penalty is permitted. However, the rabbis reinterpret it to make it impossible that the death penalty can ever be done. Based on their fidelity to the text, they're subversive with the text. And that was what it was intended. That God couldn't just say, oh, all the 2024 values I want the world to live by, I'm going to say thousands of years ago. It puts in a mechanism to move us there and in a way. And that's how I think we guide people today, too. That we don't just hit people over the head. We say, look, there is an ideal, but we're going to have to kind of get there by baby steps sometimes.
I love to hear that kind of growth because, there's the arguments in the United States about the Constitution, how to interpret it. Do you interpret it the way it was written, or do you interpret it with eyes now? And as somebody who went to church and hasn't been exposed a lot to Judaism, although my husband's mom is Jewish, which makes him Jewish, but can you explain a little bit? Dotsie brought up the Old Testament, which is the Bible, but is it also the Torah? And the Talmud is writings from the Torah. Can you explain a little bit? And then can you go into kosher, which is also the words that you've brought up that I just want to make sure all of us, the atheists, the Christians, the Hindus and stuff, all understand.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good. So there's a lot there, but let me try to say it concisely. And So firstly, yeah, the Old Testament is a term that Jews wouldn't use. It's the Christian term that implies there's a New Testament that kind of, still values the Old Testament, but more or less, surpasses it. And so usually that's referred to in Hebrew as the Tanakh, which represents these 24 books, everything from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, through the book of Esther, Psalms, Job, Jonah. I mean, fascinating books that all people study. Certainly, those committed to Judeo-Christian ethics, so to speak, study. And so, anyways, those 24 books, reaching up until about 2,000 years ago, are those primary texts. And when the biblical era ends, about 2,000 years ago, that's when the rabbinic period starts. So we go from Genesis and the creation stories and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah, and we go and all the way through all those characters. Then we go to Moses and the Exodus, and we go through, the desert, and then we go to the kings like King David and all those kings and all the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and all of that. And then the biblical era of prophecy ends, and we enter the rabbinic period of the Talmud. And the Talmud speaks in a very different voice. It's a voice of arguments. So if you've ever heard, the phrase "two Jews, three opinions," it means that Jews disagree a lot, and that's built into the culture, a culture of questioning. And that is based out of the Talmud, where the rabbis debate and argue back and forth about what the Torah meant. And that's where we are today. We're here in a culture of debate, ultimately. So that's to your first question. To your second question around kosher, some people think of kosher as just a list of rules, things like don't eat pork, don't eat shellfish, don't mix meat and milk. But there's a whole lot more to it in terms of, and some people mistakenly think it's a rabbi giving a blessing. There's no blessing that makes it kosher. Rather, it is what the ingredients are and how it's prepared. So, for example, something could be considered vegan by most of the vegan community, but still not be kosher. I'll give an example. There's many things that one looking at the ingredients would think of it as vegan, but there's some red dye in there, some coloring that actually comes from a bug extract. So most vegans wouldn't care. They'd say, oh, it's just 1% of the product anyways. The fact that my vegan product is red because, they used bugs, do I really care? And some, if they knew, might care, but most wouldn't even know. And there's other cases like that where it's a vegan restaurant that buys things that are not primarily meat or milk, but some of them, the smaller ingredients that wouldn't get noticed. So the commitment to kosher would be that someone is actually inspecting the factories to make sure what those micro ingredients are, to ensure that there's kind of a purity in that regard, in terms of what those ingredients are, and that it's not contaminated with some of those animal products, for example. So that's kind of the short answer. And the first emergence of this, going back to the Garden of Eden, a reminder for those who haven't thought of the story in a while, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, they eat it from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is to say, Adam and Eve were not moral agents prior to this eating. They didn't have a moral consciousness. It was in the first act of eating food that gave birth to a moral conscience. That's pretty amazing. That's to say that the most significant choice we make in our lives, ethically, may be what we choose to eat on a daily basis. Today, in our hyper-politicized America, people think, why am I moral? Because I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. I vote the right way every 2 years or every 4 years, so I'm a great person, right? But in fact, I eat like 24 times a day. Some people might only eat, 3 or 4 times a day. But every time we eat, we are affirming our values, making a moral choice. And that's what the story of the Garden of Eden is telling us. And that's what kashrut was intended to be. Kosher was about, when we eat, pause and say, how was an animal affected in this food? How was the land affected? How were the workers treated? How was my health affected? How do we cultivate a spiritual awakening when we consume food?
Is the second time veganism that it shows up in the book of Daniel? Or does it show up since Genesis? Because Daniel, I mean, the Daniel diet is, I've definitely heard of that. My dad called me the other day, who's a Christian, and he was in Bible study, and he's 78, like 98% vegan. Mom and you're adorable. But he's like, I think I eat the Daniel diet. Just text. That's just what he texts.
Well, that's something interesting for me to learn about, because I'm not so familiar with that idea. Yeah, the kosher laws emerged throughout Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy on various levels and of what's kind of engaged with that. It says over and over, 3 times it says, don't kill a kid with its mother's milk, which would be hard to understand. But really what that's saying, for example, in those 3 different places is don't eat meat with milk. And what I think that was ultimately doing is trying to distance us from both, distances us from the dairy industry and from the meat industry. So too, it says, chase away a mother bird before you take its eggs, by which the commentators say that a mother bird suffers, and she suffers if you take her eggs. So at the very least, if you're going to need to do it, don't let her witness it and have that trauma, which I think was moving us away from the egg industry. And so there are many examples like this that is saying, okay, you're already doing it, but do it much better than how you're doing it if you're going to do it.
Well, as I understood it, kosher was a more hygienic way of the food was less likely to make you sick because it was done in a more hygienic way. I thought that was the reason why there are specifications in Jewish law saying don't eat this and kill an animal this certain way. But I heard you mention that it might be about thinking of the animals.
It seems clear to me from studying this from a long time that there was kind of a distorted perspective put on this in terms of cleanliness, and that this is primarily about an ethical consciousness. And that the highest manifestation of kosher today is in fact veganism, that is exactly where that vehicle was moving us towards. Yes, I mean, there's no doubt there was an aspect of cleanliness. In fact, the most common consumer of kosher products is not Jews, but Gentiles, because there is an assumption that a kosher stamp means it is a healthier product. Sadly, that's not true anymore, because kosher in America has assimilated into the worst sides of capitalism, which is to say that what the kosher industry came to care about was making a bunch of money and ritual stringency and not health or ethics. And so the ideals of what kosher was about is different than actually what the kosher certifying agencies are prioritizing today. And that's one of my big campaigns, is to bring that back.
I would love for you to discuss the concept of Tikkun Olam, or repairing the world. I became fascinated in reading about you. What is its significance in Jewish tradition? And I'd love some examples of how you apply this principle in your work, in your life.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So tikkun means repair, and olam means world, repairing the world or fixing the world. And it's connected with 3 other types of tikkun. Tikkun atzmi, which means repair of self. Tikkun bayit, which means repair of family. Tikkun kahal, repair of community or society. And tikkun olam, repair of the world at large. And it actually comes from tikkun ha'elem, which means repairing the hidden dimension. If we try to repair the world on the surface level, we may cause more harm. We have to get below the surface. There's a reason why these factory farms are all hidden from our sight. Right, as Paul McCartney famously said, if anyone saw these places, right, we'd all run far from it. I think it was Paul McCartney, right? In any case, so I think that we live in a self-obsessed era where people are focused primarily upon self. And that is a repair from a world a long time ago where people only thought collectively and not about self. But we've swung too far the other way.
It's like almost like a backlash.
Yes.
And now we're way over. Yeah.
An obsession with personal well-being, personal wealth, personal health, personal enjoyment. All of that is important. but is only important if it is balanced with a responsibility for other, cultivating of empathy, responsibility for our planet and for all sentient beings. And I think that the greatest threat to our society and world is a type of self-absorption where people in an anthropocentric theology that put the person in the center of the world and oneself at the center of the world ultimately will destroy us all. That we will do whatever it takes to give ourselves more enjoyment at the expense of anyone or anything. Now, we are hardwired to put ourselves at the center. We can't get rid of that. Like, we care about self-preservation. That is a good thing, to preserve ourselves, to take our health and well-being and security, seriously. And yet, how do we continue to hardwire ourselves to also think about repairing the world towards our moral legacy in the world, that when we die from this world, very soon, I mean, maybe we'll live till 75, maybe 85, right? But we live incredibly short lives. And how do we each day say, what do I stand for? What am I here in the world to achieve? And how do I make sure that each day that is on my to-do list, not only on my to-do list, but on my to-be list?
Did you know that nearly $500 million is literally thrown in the trash every single year because of a corporate welfare scheme in the National School Lunch Program?
Wow, Dotsie. Well, what's all that taxpayer money wasted on?
You see, K through 12 schools are actually federally mandated to include a cow's milk in every single school lunch. And according to USDA data, about 1/3 of these cartons are thrown away untouched because the kids just don't want them. How's that for government waste?
That's hardly surprising, considering 1/3 of Americans are lactose intolerant, just like me. Now, I know that the WIC program provides non-dairy choices for children under 5, but it seems like the NSLP revokes that parental choice once those children enter 1st grade.
Yes, that's absolutely true, Jason. Moreover, the dairy industry gets to double dip on corporate welfare, from government subsidies on the front end to guaranteed market in schools on the back end.
This government waste is just unacceptable. Well, what's the solution, Dotsie?
The bipartisan Add Soy Act introduces competition finally into the NSLP between dairy and non-dairy milks that are nutritionally equivalent for the kids.
So the Add Soy Act doesn't remove dairy milk. It just gives kids and parents the freedom to choose the right milk for them?
Exactly. See, with the Add Soy Act, we can empower students and parents and cut government waste at the same time. Let's pass the Add Soy Act and do right by our kids.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the amount of suffering in the world that animals experience is the greatest suffering. There's so many of them. And Jews are, of course, culturally very tied to suffering. And so do very religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, do they tend to be more attuned to the suffering of animals in their daily lives practicing Judaism, or has that consciousness not gone there?
That's a great question. Yes, I just want to affirm that statement that when I look at suffering in the world, and I don't say this to minimize any form of it because it's all unique and painful, but qualitatively and quantitatively, the greatest suffering in the world is clearly among the animal kingdom. When we looked at the 80-90 billion land animals killed each year for food, not to mention the massive amounts of fish, and the thought that people used to think fish don't suffer was just a misunderstanding. In any case, so this is the great moral cause of our day, to address that. And you're also totally right that much of Jewish ritual and observance is connected to historical trauma and towards that suffering that occurred historically on many layers and continues today in many ways. Is there not to have an identity of victimhood, but is there to be empowering towards being agents of change. That said, it is true that some of the most liberal aspects of Judaism, which have assimilated from traditional Judaism, are oftentimes very universalistic, And some of the most traditional aspects of Judaism, which are very committed to tradition, are oftentimes less universalistic and sometimes are less equipped to see suffering outside of their own realm, because their whole world is their more narrow world of traditional community. And this we see in all religions. Those who are most deeply identified tend to stick with people in that world. And those who are more loosely tend to have more broader relationships. And so while we are seeing very significant progress on reduction of animal products in traditional Jewish life, we have so far to go. And the idea of empathy for an animal as it relates to kosher meat, for example, or buying milk, is so far from the discourse that's currently there. And myself, as an Orthodox Jew, I'm kind of an anomaly in this regard. As someone who's in that most traditional Jewish world, and yet, a vocal, advocate for this in that world and beyond. And am very aware of kind of the challenges and barriers involved, and continue to navigate those.
How do you approach it?
Yeah, so I think that a part of it is incentivizing and being very positive. So, for example, one of our programs at Shemayim is our Synagogue Vegan Challenge, where we give grants to synagogues to start offering exclusively vegan meals and offering that education of food justice alongside of it. So as opposed to saying the negative, don't eat this stuff, we say, hey, how great is this? And we give grants so that people can experience that. Another way is we have a debates program. I've offered to debate any rabbi of any denomination publicly in front of their community, and their community gets to vote who wins, and the winner gets $5,000. If their community votes for their rabbi, which is very likely, that eating meat is more authentically Jewish, we give a grant of $5,000 to the community. And if their community votes against their rabbi, pretty unlikely. But if they vote that they think that veganism is the best manifestation of Judaism, then Shemayim will use that $5,000 towards programming, right, to continue our education. And so I've made this offer out there, and I've done a number of them. Turns out I won one of them. And lost two of them of the first three we did. But it's a way to get into those communities to expose an alternative narrative that has been seen. So those are just two examples of how we do that.
Good on you. You're going to make it equal soon. You're going to win another one.
I love that you are giving money even though you lost. That's just beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
That's the way we get in the door.
Yeah, it's true today. Going back to agents of change, we having the ability to be agents of change, I often struggle with feeling like that the Torah says kind of God, it seems to me like God is the only one that can actually make the change. And I often wonder about leaning entirely into God can lead us humans sometimes to inaction, meaning we're told God's in control. He's got it. You don't worry. That don't worry part may be Christian. I'm not sure. But I've always felt like that can lead to, pretty egregious inaction by humans. Just like, okay, he's got it. I'll just go about my day. And then we're not an active participant in being agents of change because we're just leaning on God. And then it seems like we, I don't know, it feels like I hear a lot of people say, when they pray to God but they keep praying to him on the same thing. And I always wonder, I think he's God. I'm pretty sure he has to hear it once. Like this, it's almost like this, it's feels better to be constantly in prayer and it can just be on one issue and keep going and going and going. And I'm like, I think he's busy. Like he's got it. He's God. I see people do that when they are wanting to see something change. Maybe they don't know how to change it themselves, or they don't want to, or they think that they're incapable.
Yes. I love that question. And I hope listeners who identify as religious in one form or another of any religion forgive me if this rubbed anyone the wrong way. But I'll share my own theology here, which is that I believe and that ties in with what I articulated earlier with kosher and reinterpretation, that God progressively steps away from the world, decreasing divine involvement, increasing human responsibility. And that is to say that oftentimes what is viewed to be a religious person is to affirm one's faith that God controls the world. And what I believe is that what it means to be a religious person is to affirm one's deepest moral responsibility in the world, by emulating the divine characteristics rather than simply passively relying upon God. So this is a very different approach, and that's to say it's rather than having faith and certainty as to how God operates in the world, it's embracing the mystery and the humility of saying, we have no idea how God operates in the world. Why is it that some child dies and God didn't protect them, but this person has some miracle and God saves them? I don't have what we call the chutzpah. I don't have the arrogance to say I know how God works. So I don't try to make claims like that. I just say I'm responsible for how I live in the world. And that's all I can do. So why pray? I think that prayer is less asking for divine intervention, even when we want it so much, but reaffirming what we stand for in the world. So if I say, God, my relative is sick, heal them, what I'm saying is, be my partner to strengthen me and us so we can be agents of healing. When I say, God, help us redeem this all too broken world, what I'm saying is not just swoop in and get rid of human nature and fix it all for us. I'm saying, give us the wisdom, give us the strength so we can do what we need to do in this world.
I love
Yeah,
that.
that makes a lot more sense. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a practical question. I see on food labels the word pariv, and I've thought that, does that mean it's vegan? What does that mean?
Oh, good. I'm so glad you asked. Almost vegan, but not entirely. Pariv means it is neither meat nor milk. There's three statuses of how a product would be labeled because of meat and milk not being combined. Product would be labeled as fleischig or meat, or milchig, which means dairy, or parv, which means it's neither one. So it could be parv and still include eggs, or it could still include honey for vegans who don't eat honey, such as myself. And so that's basically what parv means.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
I have a question about the word blessed. Almost every religion uses it in some sense in relation to how their God is behaving, and he's blessing scenarios or people. And I think I struggle with it so much because the opposite of blessed, like when people say, oh, I'm so blessed, is unblessed. And so then to me, it automatically means that your neighbor who maybe just had an accident and is now in a wheelchair for the rest of her life is unblessed. Now, that person may find the silver lining to that. I understand that. But I just struggle with saying that so much because it feels holier than thou. Like I have been chosen to be blessed. I just can't get it to come out of my mouth. It makes me I tend to say lucky or whatever when something happens. They're like, wasn't expecting that. Great. How do you feel about that word? And what does Judaism say about that?
Great. I love that. So one of the things that I think is important for us as animal activists and as vegan activists is that we have one foot in the dark and one foot in the light. We have part of our consciousness aware of how enormous the suffering is, how serious climate change is, how many tens of billions of animals are being treated so cruelly and slaughtered, how many people are dying of cardiac disease based on their animal product consumption, just how much evil there is in the world of wars and selfishness and violence, and to also be in the light where we see how much goodness and beauty there is in the world. And I know people selling one or the other. I know people only selling darkness, Things are worse than you can ever imagine. I know people only selling light. We're all so blessed and everything is perfect and good. And I think we have to live in the light and in the dark. And I think part of the hardwiring, earlier I talked about hardwiring ourselves away from just self-preservation into an other consciousness as well. The other great hardwiring, I think, is away from negativity, where we are hardwired towards concerns. And that makes sense because in evolutionary psychology, there could be an animal jumping out of the bush that was a threat to us. And so we had to always be on edge about the worst thing that could happen. But today, how do we cultivate gratitude? That I believe at every moment, there is good is winning over evil. At any moment, if we just look at the news, we see wars, we see horrible things, but at every moment, there's like a million teachers holding the hands of a student, teaching them patiently. At every moment, there's a million people in hospice sitting with someone kindly who's dying. There's a million people volunteering, right? There's just so much kindness that doesn't make the news. And so how do we rewire ourselves from just thinking about the bad things in our lives towards gratitude? So what I mean when I say Baruch or I say blessed, although we don't have to be connected to that word, is at this moment, as opposed to thinking about my 10 problems that keep me up at night, I want to focus on the good in my life. And all of us have challenges and all of us have goodness. And how do we address those challenges while still living with gratitude?
And is that being blessed?
Yeah, I think
being able
blessing,
to do that and live with that gratitude and be appreciative and grateful.
Yeah, I think living a blessed life is not that I have a beautiful home and a great car and I'm healthy and check the boxes of all of our physical needs. I mean, those things are all wonderful. Being blessed is living with a sense of enough. That one of the great challenges of our day is that people feel they are not enough, which they got from their childhood. And they do all types of toxic things to try to prove they are enough. Most commonly is substance abuse. People who, having worked with people with substance abuse or who have addictions, most commonly what they're working with is filling a hole in themselves that they had from feeling they weren't enough. But people also do that with food and with sex and other types of things that they act in ways inappropriately because they have some sense that they're not enough, or based on ego and other things that they're not enough and that we don't have enough. I don't have enough, and so we live a life constantly being unsatisfied. And being blessed is a way of saying, I'm enough, whatever I am, and I have enough, whatever I have.
To wrap up, I'd like you to share a little bit about your personal life. We touched on it a little, some of the things you've done with your family and your own body, yourself, giving away your kidney, and the work that you do with the organizations that you have created.
Well, I live with the intense theological question asked at the gates of heaven, as I imagine it. Did you give more than you took? Did you give more than you took? And I can't imagine my answer possibly being yes. Just looking at my first few years of life, someone's cleaning my diapers. Then looking at sitting in a school classroom, and you just sit there and people teach you. And then having grown up, won the lottery. I won the lottery. I grew up in 20th century America as like a straight white male in a upper middle class family, right? I won the lottery. How could I ever give back as much as I've taken from the world? And so I view our lives as a chance to live joyfully, but live joyfully in service of trying to make this place better. And that's not just about sacrifice. It's not just like, oh, I want to live miserably to give everything away, right? I think it's living with this balance of, and learning how to intertwine that the way we serve and what we give in the world is joyful. I think we should choose movements and causes that bring us joy to advocate for them, even when there's a huge dark side to them. And so that's a little bit of my short answer. I spend so much of my time enjoying my family and exercising, because I love those things, family and exercise, and I love spirituality, and those things are for me, even though there's others involved. And then I try to find as much time as I can to joyfully be in service. And I've got a lot to learn and how to do that better and more impactfully. And I'm just glad to be in community with people like you two, who are so articulate and so passionate and building communities of meaning and of seeking and of impact.
We're just on Zoom, and you have the most beautiful spirit, and the explanation of the action we can take is very motivating to me. And I know it is to our listeners. So thank you so, so much.
Can you give us where people can find you before we go?
Thank you so much. Yes. Self-promotion never feels great, but
Right.
yes, there are
But
ways
you
to
need do that, because people are inspired and they want
some more rabbi in their life.
Thank you. Yes, I view myself as a rabbi for all, not just for Jews or a Jewish denomination. I see myself as a rabbi for the cows and for the chickens, a rabbi for Christians or for atheists. I'm here. I want to be someone who is that what I believe the great awakening we need is where we all live by a higher spiritual consciousness, whoever we are, of compassion in the world. And so I want to partner with everyone I can towards us working together on that. So go to rabbishmuly.com. That ought to get you most places you want to get to in terms of an email list, in terms of books I've written on various issues, including the Jewish vegan and some others. In terms of the directly related to the Jewish vegan work, Jewish animal advocacy work, that's shemayim.us, where you can subscribe to that, get involved with our campus fellowship or our retreats or our debate program or our synagogue vegan challenge or our various other forms of education or our interfaith work. And I hope to connect with our listeners. And I just wish you both so much continued success in educating and inspiring so many.